Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Friday. All this week we've been looking at the references to God's grace in the Bible. And Paul reminds us in Titus chapter 2 that this grace is given for every man. He says in verse 11, "For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men." We're reminded that God's grace is His kindness, His benevolence, His mercy, even an unmerited kind of favor. And His gift of infinite love and goodwill is for all of humankind. This is what a loving God does for His creation. He sends His only Son as a sacrifice to pay the debt for man's awful sin. So Paul describes His grace here in this way. It is the grace that bringeth salvation. You realize there is no other way for a person to be saved except through Jesus Christ. Peter told the elders in Acts chapter 4, "Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved." And Jesus reminded His own disciples in John chapter 14 and verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me." So whenever we're reminded of this in God's grace through faith, we can be saved, and so can the rest of the world. This salvation has appeared unto all men. Now for Paul, that meant that he could preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Up until this time, the Gentiles were a forgotten, excluded group that were considered hopeless because they were not a part of the chosen people. But now he realizes this salvation has appeared to all men. So what does that mean for you and me today? It means more than just including an outcast group like Paul was doing here. Salvation has appeared unto all men. This is not only a reason to shout and rejoice that every man on earth has been offered this salvation, but it's also a responsibility of ours that we share it with a lost world. Just as Jesus said, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to every creature." If indeed this salvation has appeared unto all men by God's grace, and we have the obligation and even the urgent calling to share it with a lost world. And besides going into the world and proclaiming this gift of grace, we also need to live it. In verse 12 there in Titus, he says, "Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly and righteously and godly in this present world." If we have the grace of God on our lives, we need to show it to others as an example. Verse 13 says, "And we should be looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ." We ought to be looking for Him to return. Our life ought to be a life not only of godliness, but a life of expectation. Let's live today in the mercy and the grace of God. Let's tell others about this wonderful grace of God that has appeared to all men. And let's look for the culmination of that grace, which is Jesus Christ coming one day to receive His own and take them back to heaven with Him.